Thank you very much, Mr. Roswell, and thanks once again to the organizers for this very kind invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to speak on behalf of EUROFER, the European Steel Association, which, as you might know, is the European association which groups European steel producers, both national steel makers associations and also some relevant major individual steel companies such as ArcelorMittal, Tata Steel, and so on. As Mr. Roswell has mentioned in his very kind introduction, I am a director of economic and market analysis at EUROFER. So I'm basically dealing with economic research and market analysis and following what happens in the steel market, but also in the general macroeconomic environment and in the industrial environment, which very much affect actual developments in the steel market. So my presentation will be structured along, let's say, 3 sections widely. The first will primarily deal with the macroeconomic background and macroeconomic conditions in terms of confidence indicators, GDP growth, prospect for the economy, particularly in the light of the unprecedented recession triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. Second, we'll focus on developments in steel using sectors on the demand side. So as you know, steel using sectors such as construction, automotive, mechanical engineering are our end clients, our end customers. So it is very important, extremely important for us to follow what happens in these sectors. And as a third section, we will focus more specifically on what happens in the steel market in terms of actual latest indicators on supply, which is production, particularly in the light of COVID-19 consequences on the sector, and also demand, which is apparent consumption, and also with a focus on trade, on imports. Our actual latest data are up to Q2 this year, with the exception of a few industrial confidence indicators, industrial production, which is publicly available via Eurostat. But our actual data are up to Q2, and we will also provide forecast on our outlook, our view for 2020 and 2021, both in steel using sectors and in the steel market. Provided that we must take these figures with a caveat that forecast remains subject to a very high degree of uncertainty due to the economic consequences of the COVID pandemic, which are still going on. And the figures which are presented in my presentation, particularly in the steel market, very much reflect what is already available in our latest quarterly market outlook, which we have been published as EUROFER on our website, and which I invite all of you to download and read, which is publicly available on our website. So I will quickly move on to the first section, which is an overview of macroeconomic environment and latest developments in the economy. 2020 is most likely to be the heaviest, to mark the heaviest economic recession ever recorded in the EU, as well as in other major advanced economies. Here we see developments in confidence indicators before and after the onset of a pandemic, which very much reflect the impact of the outbreak of a pandemic on the general economic sentiment and also on the industry. As you can see, the outbreak happened in March this year, leading to an almost complete shutdown of factories and industrial activity in Europe, with unprecedented consequences on industrial and economic output. And then it was followed by a rebound, a pronounced rebound in June, once lockdown measures were mostly removed or considerably eased in most European countries. And then we have a rebound in activity, which paved the way for a strong rebound also in GDP and in the economic output in Q3 this year, which, however, as you can see from the charts, both in the economic sentiment and industrial confidence, has been followed by substantial stagnation over the last 2 months, particularly in October, reflecting a new surge, a new rise in infections all over Europe. And therefore, this widespread second wave of a pandemic is already impacting considerably economic confidence. Therefore, it is casting a shadow on possible continued recovery of the economy in Q4. So Q3 has seen a rebound in economic activity in Europe, but Q4 is likely to be very much influenced by the new rise in the pandemic, in contagions, and therefore we most likely see, as we say, a double dip scenario with another GDP fall in Q4 this year in most European economies. It's interesting to see that these figures conceal, at least we report here the industrial confidence indicators, but the general economic sentiment conceals a two-speed economy, in the sense that whereas manufacturing output has continued to grow, and particularly after the rebound in June at the strongest degree in over 2.5 years, by contrast, this sector activity has remained quite depressed and very weak, has continued to deteriorate until October this year, and primarily because the harshest consequences of the pandemic and of the shutdown in economic activity was felt initially in industrial sectors, automotive, etc., and also on hotels, restaurants, and services. But in this second wave, let's say, and once some restrictive lockdown measures have been implemented in some member states recently, hotels and restaurants have been impacted most severely, whereas industrial activity has continued to work, so that factories remained open, and also steel makers were able to continue to produce after the Q3 rebound. So we have a two-speed economy, whereby services remain extremely weak, and manufacturing sector continues to provide some positive stimulus, some positive contribution to the economy. So within this background, latest quarterly GDP data pretty much reflect the rebound in Q3, which we have mentioned earlier. You see the latest Q3 quarter-on-quarter figures for major European economies, and also the US, for which the data is annualized, but it corresponds to a 7.6% on a quarterly basis, and with very pronounced growth rates quarterly. But these data appears to be already old, because, as I said, we have expectations due to negative leading indicators. We have expectations that Q4 figures will be negative, will result in negative GDP growth. So as a result, the latest annual GDP growth forecast, which we have reported on the right-hand side, pretty much reflect the continued weakness and uncertainty in the economic background. Despite some slight improvement, let's say, or at least the latest European Commission forecast released in November 2020 are slightly less pessimistic than, for example, the IMF forecast, which were published in their October World Economic Outlook. But nevertheless, we see a decline of GDP around 9.5% for France and Italy, and around 7.5% for the EU, whereas Germany will experience a more moderate recession by 5.6%, according to the European Commission in 2020. And then we also report our own EUROFER forecasts, which are available in our latest economic and market outlook, where we see more similar figures, more or less in line what has been already projected by the IMF and the European Commission. So rather similar figures, which is an unprecedented GDP recession in 2020, which should be followed by a rebound, a recovery in 2021. But however, in terms of GDP losses, these will not be recovered in 2021, and it will take at least 1.5–2 years before the GDP losses will be recovered across European economies due to the magnitude of the recession. And a last overview of quarterly developments in GDP. We show here year-on-year developments over since Q1 2018, to show that before the onset of the pandemic and the unprecedented fall in Q2 this year of 14% year-on-year, which is very much impacted by the fact that April and May, but particularly April, were the months where the harshest lockdown measures were implemented, which led to a complete shutdown of factories across Europe. But before that Q2 unprecedented fall, we see a slowdown, a continuous slowdown, a deterioration in GDP growth across Europe, which was primarily due to something which will also be presented in one of the next slides, which is the slowdown in manufacturing activity and the slowdown in trade, which has impacted the European economy considerably, at least since the second half of 2018. So GDP growth has lost momentum throughout 2018, particularly in the second half of 2018, and throughout 2019 before the unprecedented slump due to the pandemic. Then obviously in Q2 and Q3 this year, thanks to the quarter-on-quarter rebound, the year-on-year growth rate has been still negative, but at a much less negative growth rate than in Q2, -4%. But still, we expect Q4 to be to record another year-on-year growth rate, which will be negative due to negative and rather gloomy leading indicators for Q4. We go to the steel using sectors, and equally, as we have seen for the economy as a whole, developments in major steel using sectors pretty much reflect what has happened for the overall economy, with output in real terms that has been slowing down considerably, at least since the second half of 2018 and throughout 2019, with the exception of construction, which is something very important, we think, which we'll also highlight in one of our next slides. Construction has proven much more resilient than other major steel using sectors, automotive and mechanical engineering, and also more resilient than total sweep, which is total steel-weighted industrial production. The reason being that construction has its own, let's say, cycle, which is rather different from other economic cycles or from other sectors, and has proven much more resilient. Whereas, for example, automotive has paid the highest price to the slowdown in manufacturing sectors, and also to the shutdown in industrial activity due to the onset of a pandemic. It is worth, in any case, recalling that the slowdown in the manufacturing sector and in steel using sectors output observed since the second half of 2018 was due primarily to the general slowdown in the economic cycle, which was very, very positive in 2017, but also, and I would say most importantly, due to the continued rise in trade tensions at the international level, particularly after US administration decisions in terms of trade restrictions, which led to major trade frictions with China and other major trading partners, and also the weakness of the manufacturing cycle due to growing global economic uncertainty. Automotive has paid the highest price due to the reasons which I just mentioned, but also because automotive has been impacted by some growing uncertainty about new standards for electric vehicles, and a lot of uncertainty about standards around new models, which has delayed investment decisions from car makers, as well as purchase decisions from consumers. So in Q2, we see here we have a fall in automotive year-on-year by 44%, which is something unprecedented. It is an unprecedented fall in automotive output. Well, we have lower but still considerable declines in other major steel using sectors, the lowest being for construction. But however, Q2, as we have seen for the general economic cycle, is expected to be the lowest point of the cycle, the trough, after which we will see a rebound in Q3 data once they will be available. However, bearing in mind that uncertainty still remains, and Q4 is likely to be a rather negative quarter for steel using sectors output. Equally, we see other leading indicators for the industry, which signal record falls in Q2 2020. On the left-hand side, you see order books for a major steel using sectors, and it will also include metal goods. These data are taken from the European Commission, are publicly available. We see obviously a decline, a continued deterioration in order books since the second half of 2018. The worst impact being recorded for motor vehicles, particularly in the first half of 2020, but also for mechanical engineering, construction, which is the blue line, proving more resilient. And then we have a rebound in motor vehicles, which is due to the reopening of car plants as well as car dealerships during the summer. as soon as the lockdown measures were eased or removed. But then metal goods has experienced the lowest decline in order books, even after the removal of we see a moderate rise, a moderate rebound since June, due to continued uncertainty for the sector and the gloomy prospects of the sector in Europe, and also due to the continued disruptions in the supply chain, which have continued to affect the steel sector even after the removal of lockdown measures in the first and second quarter of 2020. And on the right-hand side, we see industrial production developments up to Q3. Again, these data are publicly available from Eurostat, and we see record falls in Q2, followed by, as well as for GDP, we see some, again, pronounced falls year on year in the EU and major industrial economies, but at a much lower rate than was recorded in Q2. Q2 really marked the lowest point of industrial cycle in Europe. But it's important, again, once again, to highlight that industrial production had already experienced a slowdown, which eventually resulted in year-on-year falls in all major industrial economies, and particularly also in Germany, which is the red line. We recorded 3 consecutive year-on-year falls over the last 3 quarters of 2019, and also in Spain and France, and to a lesser extent in these countries compared to Germany. Germany was much more affected because of the impact of the deterioration in manufacturing sector to the automotive industry, which is very, very important for the German economy and for the German industry. So to recap, here we present an overview of actual annual figures in terms of real output in steel using sectors, and we try to compare what has happened during the last comparable major economic recession, which has affected advanced economies, which is the so-called financial crisis. And also we have presented the actual annual growth rates in these steel sectors in the 2 years preceding before the COVID-19 recession, which are 2018 and 2019, to show that, as we've seen before, steel sectors were already hit severely in 2019 by worsening conditions in global trade and the weakening manufacturing cycle. So we during the financial crisis in 2009 and also 2010, we've seen comparable drops in output compared to what we expect might be actually the actual falls in steel using sectors in 2020, with the exception of let's say construction, which should record let's say more moderate decline in 2020 compared to what was recorded in 2009, primarily because in 2009 construction sector let's say was more severely hit by the recession, because the recession actually originated from the construction sector, from the housing market crash in the US and from the mortgage market crash, which was underlying the construction sector. Whereas mechanical engineering, automotive, and domestic appliances had similar falls, with the exception of domestic appliances, again, should also have a more moderate decline in 2020. But for example, total sweep in 2009 plummeted by 20%. We expect a lower decline in 2020 in total sweep. We also present our latest EUROFER forecasts, which are available in our economic and market outlook, which are, as I said, subject to a considerable degree of uncertainty, so it might be revised with our next report. But as you can see, we compare our forecast with what happened in 2009 and 2010, and also with what happened over the last 2 years, for which full data are available. In 2018 and 2019, we had a deterioration in steel using sectors, which led to a drop in mechanical engineering, a bit modest, but led to a relevant decline in automotive by 5% in Europe, which was which was the harshest recession since 2009, indeed, for automotive, which signaled the very weak conditions of the automotive sector in Europe. And also domestic appliances recorded a fall in output in 2019. So 2020 started with already quite heavy and conditions for these steel using sectors, and we expect 2020 to reflect the impact of COVID-19 outbreak on these sectors, primarily on automotive, as we said, which is likely to experience the harshest fall in output, to pay highest price, with a fall of almost 21%. Construction being relatively more resilient, relatively less affected, with a fall of 3.6%. Then all these sectors are expected to rebound in 2021 a different speed. But we, as for the economy, as for EU GDP, we do not expect steel sector output to recover from the losses experienced during 2020 before 2022, or more likely 2023, considering the magnitude of recession and considering the uncertainty which is likely to, let's say, continue at least over the first and second quarter of 2021. So we don't expect a full recovery in steel using sectors before at least the second quarter of 2021. And these are, as you can see on the right-hand side, our latest output forecast, which might be revised with our very next report, which will be published in end of January next year. So we have a short, let's say, a quick focus on the two most important steel using sectors for the EU steel industry, which are construction. Construction accounts for roughly 34% of apparent steel consumption in the EU. The construction sector has been obviously heavily affected by the pandemic, even though to a lesser extent than automotive, for example. Construction works, and particularly public construction works, were almost completely shut down, but were reopened in May and June once the lockdown measures were removed. But confidence in the sector has remained at very, very low levels, even after the removal of the lockdown measures, and having, let's say, fallen, having plummeted dramatically, as you can see in early 2020, due to the onset of a pandemic. And they plummeted to the lowest level since 2015 in April, obviously, and then they rebounded, but they remained at very, very low levels in historical terms, at least lowest level before since 2015. The outlook for the sector remains very uncertain. However, we see relatively better prospect for the sector, provided that the EU as a whole and EU governments have announced, as you know, and we will come back to that a bit later, have announced a massive and unprecedented public supporting scheme to the economy, to provide relief to the economy, which is the Next Generation EU, with major and relevant public investment schemes and public investment projects, which very much concern the construction sector. And public construction spending should therefore receive impetus and support by these public schemes. But nevertheless, construction will record a drop of 3.6% in 2020. At least this is our latest forecast, and will rebound next year. But construction, as I said, will remain relatively less affected by other sectors. For automotive, the picture is more dramatic. Here we present the latest passenger car sales, which give an idea, give a signal of the latest demand side developments in the automotive sector. In October, there was still a year-on-year fall by 7.8%, and the fall has been of 27% over the first 10 months this year compared to the period of last year. We had seen a small rebound in October, which could hopefully signal, let's say, a turnaround in the trend, but it hasn't been so. So commercial vehicle sales have shown a similar trend, similar pattern. And although, as we say, although dealerships have opened for business again after the removal of lockdown measures, consumer demand has not recovered, and we see that it is really not likely to recover, at least until disposable income of households will improve substantially, and job losses will be the job market will have recovered, because we do not see, frankly, a major improvement in the automotive sector from the demand side if consumer demand remains depressed as it is now. It is not very likely that, given the current economic circumstances, consumers will be willing to buy a new car. So demand is set to remain depressed, obviously, until the end of this year, and also up to at least the second quarter of next year. So this is the outlook for 2021. Output in the automotive sector is expected to be impacted the most compared to other prestigious sectors. The fall in output, in our view, is not likely to be more pronounced than in 2009, but the fall which we've seen in the second quarter of this year is unprecedented. Really, we've never seen a fall like that, and we see a rebound of 18% in 2021. So we go quickly to the steel market. To see where Europe stands in the steel market, it is important, we think, to put in perspective a few things. This is actually a long-term overview of crude steel production in Europe, regardless of product type, but it shows you the relative decline in Europe compared to other, let's say, major steel-making areas. We see, for example, we have started the series in 2008, and we see that actually crude steel production in the US never recovered from the losses experienced during the 2009 recession. In 2019, which is the latest year available, which was already affected by as we see, the slowdown in the economy and in the manufacturing sector, and the crisis in the manufacturing sector. As a result, crude steel production decreased by 6% in 2019, and over the 2008-2020 period, assuming the year-to-date figure based on our latest month available, we see a compound average growth rate, which is minus 3.1%. So we see a long-term decline in new steel production, which has happened at a time when other major steel-making regions have increased their capacity and have also increased their production. This is based on OECD data, which I won't be showing today, but they're publicly available and everybody can see that. So we have a decline in relative terms of Europe as a steel-making regions. And first, this is something on the supply side. On the demand side, I would like to highlight a few points relative to the short-term impact of the COVID-19 outbreak on the sector in Europe. This is a result of a survey, of the monthly survey, which we carry out with upon request of the European Commission. The EU steel sector has been hit very hard by the COVID crisis. In a nutshell, since March this year, the shutdown in steel-using industries in March this year has led so far to a cut in production of over 40% year-on-year compared to the same period of last year. This is updated to the latest survey which we have carried out, which is of 25th of November. And orders have also fallen considerably. They have decreased by 16% for long carbon, for flat products, and by 11% for long products. Since March this year to the latest figure available, which is November, compared to the same period of last year. And also major consequences were felt on the job market, unemployment in the sector, which led to 24% of a workforce, which is still, since March this year, still affected either by temporary layoffs or reduced working time, or consider layoff in the future. So there is still a lot of uncertainty for European steel producers, as long as the uncertainty continues, and as long as the COVID crisis continues to affect the supply chain and the ability of steel makers to produce and to meet demand. Demand, which has in turn been very, very, very weak to almost unprecedented levels. Here we present quarterly evolution of apparent steel consumption in the whole EU and also imports. Apparent steel consumption, reflecting developments in steel using sectors and in the overall economy, has continued to fall since early 2019, we have recorded up to Q2 this year 6 consecutive quarters of year-on-year falls, which were however more moderate initially, but then obviously the falls became much steeper. But interestingly, even before the onset of a pandemic in Q2, if you look at a Q1 figure for apparent consumption, you see a fall of 12%. So apparent consumption was already very much impacted by the negative steel market conditions and demand conditions in Europe. The COVID outbreak partly affected also Q1 because March figures were already included, but the impact was not felt substantially in Q1. But obviously in Q2, you see the harshest consequences on steel demand, with the demand plummeting by almost 26%. It's interesting also to see, obviously, the developments in imports. EU imports have, it's worth mentioning that, have fallen more considerably than apparent steel consumption in Q4 19 and in Q1 2020, basically due to the impact of safeguards of same products. Despite a lot of volatility in monthly imports, which we don't show here, but we have seen a lot of monthly volatility during 2019. However, imports have decreased at a very pronounced rate in the second half of 2019 and also in the first quarter of 2020. But then reflecting very much depressed demand, and also reflecting the difficulties and the issues due to the COVID outbreak for steel for steel makers due to supply chain disruption and so on. You see that in Q2, apparent consumption has recorded a more pronounced decline than year-on-year than imports. And as a result, in 2019, apparent consumption has fallen by 5.3%, which is the harshest year-on-year fall in annual terms since the recession of 2013. Then in our latest forecast is expected to plummet by 14.6%, which is slightly less pessimistic than the drop of 16.6% in our previous forecast, which was released in our previous report. Then it is expected to rebound by 13.1% in 2021. And also real consumption, which is apparent consumption adjusted by the stock cycle, is expected to follow a similar pattern, which is a fall of almost 12% in 2020 and then a rebound of 9.53% in 2021. The last slide is about developments in overall imports. Interestingly, as we've seen in the previous slide, it's true that import volumes have decreased in 2019 and also in 2020 year to date, according to our latest monthly figure available, which is September, mirroring depressed demand basically. Whereas in 2018, imports had increased, as you can see on the left-hand side, had increased on a yearly basis by 12%, reflecting rather positive demand, at least until the first half of third quarter of 2018, reflecting very positive demand and reflecting a lot of imports coming with, to let's say to EU customs. Whereas in 2019, the combination of deteriorating demand conditions and also some effects of the safeguard measures led to a fall of 13% in imports, which was more pronounced than the fall in apparent consumption, which was 5.3%. And then we expect, based on our latest year-to-date figures, we expect imports to fall by 16% in 2020. What we think is worth highlighting is on the right-hand side, you see the market shares held up by imports out of total apparent consumption for flat and long products, regardless of the exporting country. But it's interesting to see that despite the fall in imports and despite continued weakening demand in Europe, in the EU steel market, the share of imports out of total consumption has remained stable, let's say, has not decreased. And whereas, for For example, for fluff products, it has increased in Q2, has reached a record high, which is 22%. For long products, it has been more volatile in recent quarters, but still remains rather high in historical terms. So we see another issue for European steel producers, which is the market penetration of imports against a rather depressed demand, which is set to continue at least until, as we said, second quarter of 2021. So the key findings, I won't repeat most of the things which I've already said, but as you can see, the EU and the Western economies in general have experienced the harshest economic consequences ever recorded due to the pandemic. But the economic cycle should have bottomed in Q2, as well as the industrial cycle. The latest confidence indicators, on the other hand, signal that the recovery is very slow, very weak, very uncertain, subject to a lot of uncertainty. And the rebound expected in Q3 is already over, and there are clouds on the horizon again in Q4 due to the rise of the pandemic in recent weeks. On the other hand, we've seen an unprecedented public support to the European economy and the industry, the Next Generation EU package worth 750 billion euros, and then the ECB's program of purchase of government and corporate bonds on the secondary market. So the volume of this supporting package is even bigger than a Marshall Plan, which was released after the Second World War. But however, this package is still subject to political negotiation in Europe, if you follow the issue. And so there's a lot of uncertainty around it still. And also will come at the price of a considerable increase in public debt, which is not always good news for the economy, as you know. And coming to steel sectors, obviously, huge impact of the COVID-related lockdowns, which led to the worst drop on record in Q2 this year, particularly in automotive. But worth reminding that the weakness of the steel sector has already started in the second half of 2018 and that continued through 2019 due to manufacturers' trade tensions, manufacturing weakness, uncertainty in the automotive market, and so on. But as well as for the economy, the trough of the cycle should be behind us. Construction will be relatively less impacted, albeit falling, as well as other steel sectors, whereas automotive will be impacted the most. But recovery is not expected before second quarter of 2021. And equally, steel demand has seen already record lows in 2020 due to the almost stopping industrial activity in Q2, combined with heavy disruptions in supply chain. Steel demand still very depressed due to many uncertainty factors which remain in place even before the end of the pandemic, worth mentioning, because we still have the Brexit thing, which is not over. So we need to see whether the UK will remain part of the European internal market after 1st of January 2021, and once the pandemic will be over. And then the manufacturing sector is likely to remain weak still after the end of the pandemic. And steel demand has been impacted very, very severely. But as we can see, imports have continued to share a considerable share of apparent consumption despite continued weakness in steel demand. So this is very much everything from my side. Thank you very, very much for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sciamarelli, for your presentation and sharing your expertise with us. Now we shall look at the questions directed by the guests. A few questions, not many. Let me check. Okay. Ralph Behat asked, and how do you see the development of European electric arc furnace share in crude steel production versus BOF steel making? Mr. Sciamarelli.
Good question. Not easy to say. It will very much depend on also on other technological developments. But as a sector which is very much involved and committed to moving along the path of, say, reaching the objectives of the Green Deal program launched by European Commission, which has an ultimate target of decarbonization within 2050, so carbon neutral steel making process by 2050, we see let's say, gradual shift to electric furnace going on in the future. But I cannot quantify, let's say, more precisely than this, but this is a general trend, let's say.
Okay, thank you. Steven Souza asked, do you think domestic steel price trend of Turkey, will play any role in EU exporters in terms of pricing?
Not very easy to say. We've seen quite volatile developments in prices in Turkey as well as in Europe recently. As long as uncertainty remains, I think we're going to see it for quite a long time. I think what matters is for us that let's say the steel market remains open, because we want it to remain open, but also is stabilized, so to say. So it's not really important. I mean, in terms of prices, it's important in terms of, let's say, putting in place something which can assure stability in the steel market, in imports, and can prevent from excessive fluctuations and volatility.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to direct the questions related to trade restrictions, because it's not related to your field. It's outside of your field. So yeah, I will not ask them. And okay, the question Steven Souza asked, what impact do you think on EU steel export business once Joe Biden takes over the president chair?
Oh, good question. Well, we don't obviously have a EUROFER position on that, but personally speaking, I think my view is shared by other, let's say, major, more important than me, let's say, other economists and experts on that field. I don't really expect the U.S. The Biden administration to make a turnaround or to change significantly its trade policy compared to what we've seen in the last 4 years. US 232 section is still there. I think it is going to stay there. I do not expect the Democrats to be much more, let's say, free trade oriented than what the Republicans and what the Trump administration did. Yes. But this being said, I do believe and I do hope that trade relations will, let's say, would be eased to some extent. Although, as I said, Mr. Biden will try to protect some workers in some key industrial sectors in the U.S., which is something which the Democrats have done already in the past. So I don't expect huge changes in trade policy. But I, on the other hand, expect some relaxation in general trade relations between the U.S. and Europe.
And okay, the last question by Shankar Ramnarayan. It's a little difficult question for me, but it's talking about merger and acquisition activities. Yes, he says merged companies do not report healthy profits. Has it impacted job markets? What do you think about it?
It is not fully clear to me what healthy. Okay. Oh, yeah. I understand. Yeah, their profits were not. Yeah, their profits were not remarkable. That's what. Well, if the question is, does the EU industry have a regret about that? We never have regrets. We, as an association, we have a position which is clear. We welcome any merger or acquisition in the EU steel market, which may increase the, let's say, which may, let's say, place the European steel market better off in the global environment, the global competition. And so whatever might reinforce the position of the EU steel market is welcome. There was a European Commission action a few years ago which prevented the merger from taking place, which we didn't welcome, but okay, fine. We accept what the European Commission does. And yeah, in terms of obviously profits very much reflect what is happening in the EU steel market, which I've shown in my presentation, I think. So it's, yeah, this is something which we have to cope with.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Sciamarelli. And we have highly appreciated your time. Please take good care of yourself. Thank you again. Okay.
You too. Thank you very much again for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure for us also. Thank you.
Thank you.